The forest greeted me with an unsettling silence, the kind that drills into your bones long before cold air can do the same. I had heard the locals call this place the Wolf's Lair, a forbidden stretch of untamed wilderness buried deep beyond marked trails, where even hunters refused to wander after dark. Legends whispered of glowing eyes peering through misty nights, of lone travelers who vanished without a scream, and of ancient spirits guarding the wild. But I didn't come here for legends. I came here to test myself in a place where survival wasn't a concept to play with, but a brutal law written in hunger, fear, and instinct. Each step I took into the thick forest felt like a silent pact with nature, a promise that I would either earn my right to stay or leave as bones buried beneath roots. My boots sank slightly into damp earth cushioned by years of decayed leaves, while tall pines loomed like watchful guardians. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through their dense canopy, casting fragmented beams of gold that flickered like the final light of a dying torch. I carried only a backpack with essential tools: my knife, a small hatchet, fire striker, some cordage, a folded top, and a stainless steel bottle. Everything else I would have to rely on the forest to provide. As I moved deeper, bird calls faded. The quiet became heavy, almost intentional, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, assessing me. The scent of wet moss, pine sap, and distant rain clung to the air. A faint chill crawled across my neck like invisible fingers, urging me to look back. But turning back was not an option. I had come here to build a shelter where no human eyes could spot it, in the very territory ruled by wolves, to see whether I could carve out a secret sanctuary with only my will and the raw materials of nature. The deeper I walked, the more the world I knew faded behind me. No sound of roads, no distant hum of civilization, only the occasional crunch of leaves under my boots and the rhythmic thud of my heartbeat. A crow cawed somewhere overhead, a harsh, mocking cry that seemed to say you don't belong here. But I pushed forward, brushing past branches that snagged my sleeves, their jagged edges like claws testing my resolve. I could feel my breath warming inside my chest, slow and steady, each inhale laced with a mixture of excitement and an unspoken fear I refused to name. The forest here wasn't just alive, it was ancient, wise, and indifferent. I wasn't here as a conqueror. I was an intruder seeking acceptance. The sun began to sink lower, staining the sky with streaks of orange and violet. Shadows stretched long and sharp, merging into a creeping darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a low howl drifted through the trees, soft at first, then rising into a chilling crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the air like a primal warning. The sound halted me mid-step. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough to ignore. My pulse quickened. Wolves, the true masters of this domain, were announcing their presence, reminding me that I was entering their world. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the sound wash over me, steadying myself. Fear, I reminded myself, is not the enemy. Panic is. So I walked on, steadily, deliberately, with a new awareness of eyes that might already be watching me from the shadows. I chose this forest precisely because it was merciless. I wanted to disappear from the noise of modern life, from routines that numbed the spirit. I wanted to build something real with my own hands, a hidden shelter buried in nature, a fortress of solitude where I could feel every heartbeat as a declaration of survival. As night grew closer, I knew I had to find a temporary spot to rest before searching for the perfect shelter location at dawn. The forest floor sloped downward toward a shallow ravine carpeted with wet ferns and rotting logs. A stream whispered softly nearby, just audible enough to promise fresh water. But I couldn't stay near open water. Predators frequented such places after dark. Instead, I found a cluster of evergreen trees with dense branches, their foliage forming a rough natural canopy. I dropped my backpack, rolled my shoulders, and exhaled slowly. The earth beneath me was cold but stable, a place to at least sit and gather my thoughts before darkness swallowed the forest whole. I unclipped my small top and draped it low between two thick roots, enough to shed light rain and shield me slightly from wind. I didn't bother making a fire tonight. Too risky to attract attention before I understood this territory better. I sat in silence, back against a tree, hands clasped loosely around my knees. The cold crept into my fingers, but I ignored it. As dusk bled into night, the forest awakened with sounds that felt amplified by the darkness. Twigs snapped somewhere to my left, perhaps a deer, perhaps something else. My breathing slowed intentionally, a controlled rhythm to keep my nerves from spiraling. I listened carefully, tuning in to every rustle of leaves, every distant flap of wings. Then came another howl, longer this time, joined by others. A chorus. The pack was calling out, their voices rising and falling like a haunting symphony that echoed through the forest canopy. My stomach tightened, but I inhaled deeply and let the sound pass through me like wind through branches. I whispered in my mind, respect, not fear. Wolves were not my enemies, they were survivors like me, bound by instinct and purpose. I wasn't here to challenge them, I was here to endure alongside them. As the night settled heavily around me, I wrapped my arms over my chest and closed my eyes for short intervals, drifting into light, alert rest. The forest did not allow deep sleep, not on the first night. Every shift in wind, every crack of wood felt like a question. Will you last here? Or will you run? By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the trees, painting the forest in a foggy blue haze, I already felt changed. I stretched my limbs, stiffness clinging to my muscles like frost. I gathered my top and repacked my gear with quiet precision. Today would mark the beginning of my true test, a search for a location hidden enough to build a secret shelter, strong enough to withstand storms, and isolated enough that even passing wolves might overlook it. As I took my first step deeper into the forest, I paused and glanced back at the spot where I had survived my first night in the wolf's lair. There was no trace left behind, no ashes, no footprints, no sign of my presence. That was the rule. If I wished to belong here, I had to move like a shadow, unseen and forgotten. The wolves had sung their warning. Now it was my turn to answer with silent determination. With a steady breath and a firm grip on my hatchet, I moved forward, deeper into the unknown, ready to find the place where my hidden life in the wild would begin. Morning settled over the forest like a cautious whisper, gentle but filled with quiet warnings, and I pressed onward with a purpose sharpened by the long night. My boots sank into soft moss with every step, releasing the earthy scent of damp soil and rotting wood, while my eyes searched for a terrain that offered both concealment and strategic security. I needed a place hidden from open sightlines, away from animal trails yet close enough to resources like water and dry timber. As I trekked deeper, I noticed subtle signs that marked the forest's living network. Claw marks etched into bark, broken branches high off the ground, possibly where a deer had struggled or something large had rubbed against it, and faint paw prints suggesting wolves had passed through sometime in the night. Each clue etched itself into my awareness, not as panic but as information. Survival was as much about reading the land as it was about enduring it. After an hour of steady movement, I veered off a natural slope that descended toward a darker, denser section of the woods. The trees here grew tighter together, their branches interlocking like fingers forming a sheltering cage above. Thick layers of old pine needles cushioned the ground, muffling sound and creating a natural insulation that spoke of warmth and dryness. Not far from here, I spotted a fallen tree, massive, ancient, its roots torn from the earth in a violent spiral. Its trunk lay at a slight angle, half lifted off the forest floor by thick roots twisted like frozen serpents. Behind it, there was a small natural recess, partially shielded from wind, nearly invisible unless someone circled around the back of the root wall. It felt like the forest itself had carved out a secret space, hidden, protected, and silently waiting. I paused, crouching low, scanning the surrounding terrain. The slope above would help divert rainwater, and the dense canopy overhead promised decent coverage from heavy weather. The fallen log could serve as the primary support beam for the hut's roof structure. The thick ferns and shrubs surrounding it would provide natural camouflage. It was nearly perfect, not just as a shelter location, but as a secret hideaway. As I traced my fingers along the rough bark, I imagined the frame of the shelter rising here, blending so seamlessly with the environment that even a casual wanderer would walk right past it without noticing. Wolves, cautious as they were, might sniff around but would likely not linger if I masked my scent and maintained cleanliness. This would be my sanctuary. I dropped my backpack beside the fallen trunk and stood silently for a moment, listening. There was no immediate sound of predators, only the distant rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker and the lazy breeze rolling through treetops like a sigh. My mind began charting the blueprint of the shelter, a low structure, semi-dug for insulation, with log walls angled inward to deflect wind and rain, roofed with branch lattice covered in moss, bark, and grass. The fallen tree would act as both a spine and a shield. I pulled out my hatchet, feeling its familiar weight in my grip, and began gathering straight, sturdy branches about the length of my arm span for the frame supports. Each swing of the hatchet echoed slightly, a reminder that noise could invite unwanted attention, so I worked deliberately but efficiently, keeping my breathing steady. Sweat formed across my forehead despite the cool air, trickling down my temples. I hauled the cut branches back to the chosen spot, laying them in a neat stack beside the log. Before committing fully to building, I needed to assess the soil beneath, if it was too soft. The walls wouldn't hold. Too rocky and digging would be a nightmare. I knelt and used the hatchet to scrape away the pine needles, revealing firm, slightly damp earth mixed with compacted root systems. It was a good foundation. A wave of quiet satisfaction passed through me. I stood again and took in the scene. The morning light struggled to reach this hollow, creating a shadowed atmosphere that felt secretive, untouched. With each passing moment, the location felt more like destiny than choice. Before beginning construction, I needed more materials: long, sturdy logs for the hut's frame, pliable green branches or vines for lashings, insulation layers like moss, dry leaves, and small branches for a thatched effect. I set off to collect what I needed, marking trees mentally for future trimming. I avoided cutting too close to the shelter area to maintain natural camouflage. As I worked, I felt the rhythm of survival settle into my muscles, the steady cadence of chopping, lifting, gathering, stacking. Each piece of wood I carried felt like a step toward building not just a structure, but a temporary identity. The wild craftsman, the forest dweller, the silent ghost among wolves. At one point, as I was dragging a particularly thick log, I froze. Soft crunching echoed nearby. I dropped into a crouch, gripping the hatchet tightly. My ears strained to follow the sound, heart thudding hard in my chest. A few tense seconds later, a shape moved between trees, a deer, alert and cautious, nose twitching as it tested the air. It glanced my way briefly before darting off, hooves cracking through underbrush. I let out a slow breath, relieved, but the reminder was clear: I was never unseen. The forest was watching me, even when it didn't speak. Returning to the site, I began placing thicker logs against the fallen tree, angled outward like ribs forming the skeleton of the hut. I used roots and vines to roughly secure them for now, tightening lashings later once the full frame was done. As I worked, my breathing synchronized with movement, a meditative pattern taking over. Doubt occasionally tried to creep into my mind, questions of whether I could withstand storms, isolation, predators. But each time I placed another log, the shelter became more real, and fear faded beneath purpose. Hours passed in silent labor. The sun now stood higher, though light here remained dim due to thick canopy. When I paused to drink from my bottle, I took in the scene. The beginnings of a hidden refuge taking shape, a secret skeleton emerging from earth and wood, bound by my effort and will. Even unfinished, it felt alive, like something the forest might accept as one of its own if built with respect. And then, drifting faintly on the wind, came another howl, distant, but unmistakable. It rolled through the trees, hollow and haunting, as though acknowledging my presence once more. This time, however, I didn't pause out of fear. Instead, I closed my eyes, let the sound pass through me like a cold current, and continued building. I was no longer just a visitor here. I was laying the foundation of my existence within the wolf's lair. The challenge had shifted. It was no longer about whether I would stay, but whether I could build something strong enough to last. The day bent into a long, patient labor that felt less like work and more like a conversation with the forest. Each cut, each placement of a beam was an answer to the land's own questions, and slowly the hut moved from blueprints in my head into a tangible thing rooted in earth and wood. I began by sinking a shallow trench along the inner curve of the fallen trunk, a semi-dug foundation that would lend insulation and a lower profile to the structure, and I pressed my shoulder into the hatchet until my arms burned, splitting and shaping logs to fit snugly against one another like teeth in a jaw. The frame rose by degrees, first the ribs, then the crossbeams, each joint lashed with cordage made from stripped inner bark and braided vines I had spent the morning harvesting. My hands grew raw and slick with sap and sweat, but the rhythm of tying and tightening tied me to the moment and pushed doubt aside. For the walls, I stacked smaller logs horizontally, interlocking them where possible and packing gaps with moss and shredded bark to keep a draft from finding its way inside. I worked with a craftsman's impatience, tapping and wedging until each layer felt immovable. To give the hut a breath of daylight without betraying its presence, I scavenged a handful of old glass bottles from an abandoned campsite marker I found days earlier in the undergrowth. Carefully washing and corking them, I embedded them high in the wall to catch the low-angle morning light and scatter a greenish, muted glow within, an honest, primitive window that would not glint like a modern pane but would throw soft shapes inside the dim interior. Above, the roof took shape as a lattice of long poles tied to the spine of the fallen trunk and anchored to stout uprights. I layered the lattice with a thatch of long grasses, flat bark strips, and a final blanket of living moss and fern, pressing it down so rain would bead up and run off rather than soak through. Building the sleeping platform demanded more care. I wove a raised pallet from split branches and tied it fast to sturdy crossbeams to keep me above the icy seep of the ground, then layered it with thick moss, dry heather, and a woven mattress of bundled leaves that I packed tight so the surface would pillow the body and trap heat. Small, deliberate decisions multiplied into comfort, a windbreak here, a raised hearth platform there, each addition less showmanship than necessity. I built a small, low-angle entrance that required stooping to enter. It was a choice made to preserve warmth and to hide my silhouette from any casual observer. I dug a shallow drainage channel sloping away from the entrance to carry rainwater around the foundation, and I camouflaged the exterior with hanging sheets of bark and scattered branches so the structure would read to any passing eyes as only another pile of forest debris. Midway through the afternoon, clouds gathered fast, the light dimmed, and a thin, cold When the first full howl of the evening rose, close enough now that it set the hair along my arms to attention, I paused and felt the weight of what I had done. This was no longer a sketch or an experiment. It was a shelter that could mean the difference between being cold and being alive. My hands, clever and calloused, fashioned a primitive latch for the entrance and a simple trap-like alarm made from thin branches and a string of beads that would clatter if anything heavy brushed past the doorway. I lay out a few salted fish and set a small, covered pot to boil over a controlled ember, listening all the while to the wood's nocturnal traffic, the distant pads of something large moving through leaf litter, the softer scurrying of smaller animals claiming their own territories, and beneath it all the low, periodic chorus of wolves reminding the night who belonged to it. There were moments when the solitude felt like a hard, sharp thing that pressed against my chest, but there were also moments of quiet clarity. Here, with every seam sealed and every beam lashed, I had carved out a pocket of permanence in a place designed to resist permanence. Here I had traded the predictable comforts of civilization for the authentic, raw demands of survival, and the hut, imperfect and breathing, stood as evidence that work and reverence could coax shelter from wildness. As darkness gathered and my small fire threw a warm, sputtering circle of light, I crawled onto the raised pallet and stared at the moss-covered ceiling, feeling exhausted to the marrow yet strangely buoyed by the knowledge that I had made something that the wolves might pass by without recognizing as mine. The wind moved outside, testing edges and sighing through layered branches, but the structure held, and as I drifted toward a shallow, alert sleep, images of tomorrow's tasks, reinforcing the roof, expanding the larder, setting better snares, swam through a fog of muscle fatigue and satisfaction, a steady promise that if I continued to match effort with respect, the wolf's lair would not be a sentence but a place that could, in time, accept me. The next morning greeted me not with sunlight but with a muted silver haze, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting to see whether I truly belonged here or had merely survived by chance. The air held a bite, a sharp reminder that even with shelter, I lived on the edge of comfort and danger in equal measure. My body ached from the strain of construction, but there was no room for hesitation. Survival is a routine forged through repetition, and today would shape whether this hut became a home or a temporary refuge destined to rot beneath creeping moss. I stepped outside, carefully resetting the primitive alarm of beads and twigs, and scanned the earth around the shelter. Fresh tracks patterned the damp soil, paw prints, broad and deep, more than one set, circling but never pressing too close, as though the wolves had inspected my boundary in the night and left a quiet warning that I was tolerated but not accepted. With a slow breath I set to reinforcing the hut's weakest points, driving sharpened stakes deeper around the foundation, creating a ring of deterrence that would not stop a determined predator but might give me enough time to respond. I adjusted the thatch on the roof, pressing fresh moss into thinning patches, mindful that heavy rain or snow could collapse everything if I allowed weakness to spread. Once the shelter's integrity felt strengthened, I turned to the next crucial necessity: food security. The berries and jerky from my small pack would not last forever, and survival demanded preemptive effort. I followed a game trail deeper into the woodland, marking my path with small, discreet carvings in trees that only I would recognize. Along the way I gathered dry tinder, wild mushrooms I had confidently identified from prior experience, and long, flexible branches that would serve in trap-making. I found a narrow path leading to a shallow stream. Its banks showed evidence of small animal traffic, likely rabbits or growth-feeding rodents, and I selected 2 promising locations to set simple deadfall traps constructed from carved triggers and weighted logs. Each trap took careful balance. Too sensitive and they'd trigger empty, too stiff and the prey could steal bait without consequence. As I worked, I remained aware of the silence around me. No birdsong, just the distant, soft crunch of something large moving through foliage, its steps unhurried, confident, a reminder that I was not the apex here. Once the traps were set, I moved upriver to fill my water flask, filtering it through layers of charcoal, sand, and cloth I had rigged from gathered materials. The first sip was earthy but clean, bringing life back into parched muscles. Returning to the shelter, I arranged a drying rack outside the entrance, constructing it from forked branches and horizontal poles. This would allow me to smoke and preserve meat if the trap succeeded, preserving energy for days when hunting might be impossible due to weather or threat. Inside the hut, I reorganized the space for efficiency, carving a shallow shelf into the trunk wall, storing flint, cordage, and small tools within reach. I cultivated the fire, feeding it gradually until the embers glowed with steady warmth, then boiled water with mushrooms and roots, turning them into a simple broth that steam-kissed my face with comfort. As I ate, I listened again to the forest. Soft patter of drizzle beginning to fall, branches shifting with wind, the slow, distant groan of trees bending. With each sound I felt myself sinking with the environment, no longer a visitor but something being shaped by the wild, refined through repetition and vigilance. The day blurred into tasks, testing the stability of the sleeping platform, reinforcing the smoke channel with clay dug from a nearby bank, fashioning a crude spear from a straight branch carved to a hardened tip in the flames. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened further, clouds bruising with the promise of a storm. I checked the traps again. One triggered, though empty, the bait gone, teaching me that the lever arm needed tightening. I reset it with a sharpened precision, feeling a calm determination rather than disappointment. Survival was not just enduring failure but learning from it quickly. Back at the hut, rain came in earnest, drumming softly against the moss-covered roof, the sound both soothing and cautionary. I tested for leaks, only a slight trickle near the rear seam, easily patched with packed moss and bark strips. As night fell, I sat by the low fire, eating the last of my rations while sharpening the spear and carving additional stakes that could serve as deterrents or future trap components. The wolves howled again, closer now, their howls not a threat but a declaration of territory. I whispered silently to the dark, not in fear but in a quiet vow that I would endure, that this place would not break me. Lying back on my pallet, Wrapped in the faint warmth of the fire's afterglow, I let the storm's lullaby and distant cries of predators blend into a single reminder. I was alive today because I had built, prepared, and respected the laws of the wild. But tomorrow, the test would begin again, and only through grit and instinct could I carve my existence into the wolf's lair without becoming part of its stories of prey. By the dawn of the third day, the forest felt different beneath my feet. Not tamer, not welcoming, but aware of me in a new way, like an ancient beast watching to see if I was prey struggling toward exhaustion or a creature stubborn enough to carve out a place among its rhythms. I woke before the grey light fully claimed the sky, the embers in my hearth still faintly glowing, and stepped outside into air so cold it felt like it was testing whether I still had the will to breathe. The traps were my first destination, my boots dampening from morning dew as I followed the narrow path I had memorized by heart. At the first sight, my heart lifted slightly. A catch. A small rabbit lay beneath the weighted log, neck cleanly broken, its body still warm, the forest offering sustenance not as a gift, but as a trade for persistence. I whispered a quiet thanks, not out of ritual but respect, and swiftly reset the trap. A second trap further down yielded nothing but disturbed bait, another lesson etched in the details of tension and angle. Still, the success of even one catch felt like a turning point. Back at the shelter, I prepared the rabbit with efficient precision, skinning it and cleaning the flesh before setting it on the rack to smoke slowly over a carefully controlled, low-smoldering fire. The scent of cooking meat hung in the air like a fragile promise of strength. As the hours passed, I used the time to expand my perimeter, carving more defensive stakes and arranging them outward like the thorns of some primitive fortress, each point angled to deter any curious predator from approaching silently. I fashioned a new tool, a sling from braided bark fibers and a smooth, curved piece of wood, which I tested against tree trunks, practicing until I could consistently strike bark at distance. The effort made my arms throb with fatigue, but each thud of stone on wood whispered reassurance that I was not defenseless here. I felt myself subtly changing too, movements growing quieter, breath naturally sinking with the sway of branches, instinct sharpening to catch the smallest crunch of leaves or shift in wind direction. Yet with growth came new unease. That afternoon, while gathering more firewood, I came across a fresh wolf track, larger than any I had seen before, pressed deep into soft earth as though the creature had paused to listen. And beside it, a second, smaller print, likely juvenile. They were close. Very close. The understanding hit like a chill. My presence was no longer curiosity, it was noted. I returned to the hut with heightened caution, eyes scanning every shadow, every dark cluster of undergrowth that could conceal movement. I reinforced the smoke vent, bound the roof seams tighter, and adjusted the bead alarm so it would sound more sharply in case of disturbance. As evening fell, the rabbit finished smoking, and I stored half inside a bark-wrapped container near the sleeping platform, chewing slowly on a portion by the fire as night crept in with quiet menace. The howls did not come immediately as they had before. Instead, there was silence, long and oppressive, as though the pack had shifted strategy, from distant warnings to deliberate observation. I sat in that silence a long while, gripping the spear I had carved, the firelight flickering across its hardened tip. The forest around me pulsed with a tension I could feel more than hear, a silent agreement that survival from this point would not just be about building and preparing, it would be about standing firm when something tested whether I truly belonged. That night, as I lay on the pallet, firelight casting breathing shadows across the roof, I understood with clarity that the wolf's lair was no longer merely a place where I had built a shelter. It had become an arena of endurance, a proving ground where spirit and instinct would be measured against fang and frost. And as I drifted into a half-alert sleep, one hand still resting on the spear, I wasn't afraid, not exactly. I was aware, alive, and ready. The fourth night arrived with a kind of hollow silence that felt like the forest was stepping back, clearing space for something inevitable to happen, and as I sat by the dim, ember-fed glow of my controlled fire, every breath I took felt heavier, as though I were inhaling more than air, something like expectation or warning. The wolf's lair no longer felt distant or metaphorical. It now felt close, as though I were living inside the very lungs of the forest's most dangerous secret. The earlier howls had faded in frequency, replaced instead by a stalking quiet that pressed against the hut walls like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. I sharpened the spear again, not out of need but out of ritual, the rhythmic scraping of wood and stone anchoring me while my mind prepared for what instinct insisted was coming. I reinforced the door latch, checked the bead alarm twice, and kept the sling and a handful of smooth stones beside me. My tools, once crafted for hunting and survival, now stood as the thin line between me and teeth in the dark. When the forest finally exhaled, it came as a crunch in the underbrush, a deliberate step, followed by another, light yet weighted with purpose. My breath stilled. I moved to the entrance, heart steady but alert, and listened. The movement came again, slower now, as though testing whether I would respond. Then, a low, rumbling growl broke the silence outside, not aggressive but probing, as though a question were being asked without words. "Do you fear me? Do you belong here?" I didn't answer aloud. Fear would have been natural, but fear was not in control. I gripped the spear tightly and remained silent in the shadows, watching through a tiny gap in the bark. The wolf stepped into view, moonlight giving shape to its form, larger than I imagined, its coat a blend of shadow and silver, its eyes bright with a knowing intelligence that made it feel less like an animal and more like a guardian of something older than mankind. It did not charge or howl, it simply stared at the hut, nose lifted slightly to catch my scent carried in soft curls of smoke. After a moment, another shape emerged, a smaller wolf, likely the same juvenile whose print I had seen near the stream. It lingered close to the larger wolf, curious but cautious, its gaze flickering between the alpha and the shelter I had built. I stayed motionless, barely breathing, the air thick with an invisible negotiation. After several long heartbeats, the alpha wolf released a short, quiet huff, a sound not of threat, but acknowledgement, and turned away, the younger one following reluctantly after a final glance toward the hut. They did not run. They departed with the calm confidence of creatures that had no need to prove power. Only when their footsteps faded back into the belly of the forest did I exhale, a long, quiet breath that trembled less with fear and more with the weight of what had just passed. Not an attack, but a test of presence, and perhaps the beginning of a fragile understanding. I returned to my place beside the fire, not triumphant but grounded, aware that true survival wasn't about conquest. It was about coexistence, about learning to walk the line between strength and humility in a world where every creature had earned its place through trial. As the night wore on, I rested lightly, mind turning over the moment like an ember being fanned into a steady flame of resolve. With dawn, I rose not just to repair, fortify, and gather, but to refine, to build smarter, live quieter, and move with the rhythm of the forest rather than against it. I adjusted the traps with gentler angles, reinforced the water filtration system with more charcoal layers, extended the perimeter with a second ring of defensive stakes, and carved a series of symbols into a nearby tree that only I would recognize as territory markers, not as a challenge, but as a declaration of coexistence. Over time, days would blend into a cycle of gathering, strengthening, and adapting, each task shaping me further into someone the forest did not reject. The wolves would continue to pass through the territory, at times leaving tracks near the boundary of my clearing, but never again testing the shelter with uncertain steps. And in quiet moments, sitting by the low fire as the smoke curled skyward through the vent, I would sometimes hear a distant howl answered by another, and I would feel something deeper than fear or dominance, something like respect. In the end, the hut in the wolf's lair was more than wood, moss, and sweat. It was a testament to what can be built not in defiance of the wild, but in alignment with it. I came into this place as a stranger seeking survival, but I endured as something more, an echo in the forest's story, a presence acknowledged, a life that belonged not because I took from the wild, but because I learned to live within it. And as the wind whispered through the trees and the night settled once more under the watch of silent eyes, I understood that survival had transformed into something stronger. A bond, forged in fear, tested in solitude, and sealed in the acceptance of the wolves who walked the darkness without needing to hunt me to know I had earned the right to stay.